Yeah, it's what would make it happen. Otherwise, one society. Now in phase 23. Yes. Well, yes, in theory, and in practice, like mostly the London universities, the universities of London help, but we also have colleagues in Spain, France, starting switching people from Greece, yeah, of Italian society. Now we expanded. Yes, very exciting.
Domando so sul canale YouTube delle mie attività.
Especially with my parents.
Non so, sai. Ho più YouTube anch'io, quindi.
This is the second year of the
Sai, sì. Te lascio io trovo io. Me l'avevano mandato. Sì, non so più. Ecco qua. Lo posso fare io dopo? Io posso tirare. Sì.
In realtà, c'è mi piace vedere I think you're sono everything. No,
Oh, ciao caro, come stai?
Ah, devi fare la domanda.
Allora, un po' framework economici, vediamo un po' su ovviamente si fanno tante domande, neanche a molte di politica in realtà.
Allora, se ci metti il sì, secondo me, allora, io proverò a pensarmi e poi andiamo da persone faccio le domande che probabilmente manderò insieme. Televisione 5 minuti
Spalmiamo television star,
Ok, facciamo fire side.
Come ci guida lei?
No pressure.
Abbiamo loro.
Abbiamo una riparto in totale, quindi sì.
Bisogna lavorare. Se no.
Sì, cioè io ho provato a coprire anche quindi sì, direi
prendete anche domande dal ministri come sempre
posso farli insieme.
Chi è che ha detto no?
Tutto il team me l'hanno impedito. Alla fine iniziano poi
io sono andato
quindi sì. Per fortuna vi ringrazio per aver spostato.
No, vabbè. No, allora sì, quindi io mi ero mentalizzato su perché no, anche perché perché quindi io ho pensato una roba di 10 anni coincideva alla fine è andato tutto bene. Alla fine però all'inizio è stato un po'. No, ma è sempre stato sì, però adesso no, è visto che
secondo me sì. Poi mi trovo un po' sul palco.
ma sì. Ah, noi cosa facciamo qui e saliamo dopo l'introduction? Ci
No,
saliamo
no,
di
secondo me
Mi metto, dai, metto io qua. Lorenzo, tu magari al centro, dai.
forse qua può stare così. Così.
Quando andavo in Spagna a vedere i clienti, tutto mi sembrava che bello vivere a Londra, che fortuna. Adesso è il contrario. C'è un senso di commiserazione. Siete rimasti a Londra. Cosa ti è successo? Sposato un inglese, mi dispiace. Però la prospettiva è cambiata un po'. Purtroppo. Il Brexit.
Simpatica queste cose.
Ma un po' è cambiato, la percezione all'interno dell'Europa. Magari globalmente no, però in Europa un po' si sente. No, esatto, dico a livello globale no, però sai quando.
Dentro lo sci c'è stato voglia. Poi che nei ristoranti anche italiani c'è quasi impressionante.
Sì, no.
Dove la legge prende una informazione nei ristoranti ha messo di io
Non sapevo.
ma dai,
L'indiano
vuol dire devo assumere un indiano, l'italiano ci deve perché fa parte del
pacchetto
del brand. E adesso poi nei ristoranti che sono indiano, messicano,
Sì, 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 non sapevo.
Aspettiamo un attimo 2 minuti che stanno entrando ancora gente, poi poi partiamo.
Atmosfera, ma anche conoscenza.
No, no, certo, certo. Sì, sì. No, no, ma sì, no. No, questo
Io non
non ha la luce.
non l'ho attivato.
Sì,
Insomma.
Sto aspettando un attimo di fare entrare le ultime persone, se non stia arrivando qualcuno. Okay, welcome everyone to the day 3 of 2024 Italian Symposium. Here we have 3 esteemed economists for the panel 2024 Economic Outlook. And together with them, there is Sara Chemello, who is moderating the discussion of the first panel of the third day of the 2024 Italian Symposium. I would like to thank the Italian societies for helping us, the LSE Italian Society, the Oxford Italian Society, as well as the speakers for being here and supporting us in this event. Thank you very much and enjoy.
Thank you, Umberto. Can everybody hear me? I think so. It's an honor to introduce our speakers today. We're joined by Fabio Balboni, who is the Senior European Economist and Director at HSBC. Before this role, he has worked at Her Majesty's Treasury, as well as the European Commission and the United Nations Development Programme. He holds a master's in economics from the LSE and a PhD from the University of Bologna. Prof. Lorenzo Codogno is the founder and chief economist of LC Macro Advisor, and he's also a visiting professor in practice here at the European Institute of the LSE, as well as the College of Europe. Prior to this, he was chief economist and director general at the Treasury Department of the Italian Ministry of Economy and Finance, after 11 years as managing director, senior economist, and co-head of European economics at Bank of America here in London. And he also holds a master's in finance and economics from Syracuse University in New York. And then we have Professor Brunello Rosa, who is the CEO and head of research at Rosa and Rubini. And he's also a senior executive fellow at the SDA Bocconi, as well as visiting professor at City University and the LSE. He's the president of Talented Italians in the UK, a network of Italian professionals that through many initiatives supports Italian talent and aims to create this brain circulation between Italy and the UK. So very, very similar mission to United Italian Societies. Some of his previous roles include being a markets and monetary policy analyst at the Bank of England, and he also holds a master's in finance and economics from the LSE. So welcome back to your university, and thank you for joining us today. Great. So I want to start from the macro picture. So we saw last year Europe's economy just narrowly escaping a technical recession in the second half of the year, and overall we saw stagnation in real GDP. We know this is because of the continued shock to the supply due to the war in Ukraine, as well as the interest rate hikes, whilst demand was still recovering from the COVID-19 crisis. So, Mr. Balboni, with these expected but yet uncertain ECB rate cuts on the horizon this year, which in theory should boost demand, do you still anticipate a recession going forward, or are we headed towards a soft landing?
Yeah, so we're not anticipating a recession. As you said, we're not talking about spectacular growth rates. So it's been effectively growth has been broadly flat for more than a year now. But having said that, I mean, if you think that the ECB has hiked rate by 450 basis points, the most aggressive hiking cycle in history, I mean, to some extent, it's quite surprising that we have avoided a recession altogether. So it's a good starting point for Europe. I'll probably stress maybe 3 reasons which have contributed to avoiding a recession. And I would say one is the fact that we entered these energy crisis as households and firms with a better position in terms of balance sheet. We didn't have the kind of the imbalances that we had heading into the global financial crisis, for instance, the buildup in debt that we had. And of course, some of the fiscal policy measures, and that's point number 2, that have been used to kind of tackle the COVID and later the energy crisis have helped to bolster this balance sheet further, supporting households and firms. So that provided the little bit of extra fuel that has helped kind of families and firms navigate through this period of higher inflation, and also help them to continue invest. For instance, if you think about firms that have seen a significant increase in their borrowing costs, but have been able to use some of the cash and their own kind of generated resources to keep investing. So I think, those 2 elements have been very important to understand why, at least so far, and we believe also in the future, we will be avoiding a recession. And the third point I would make is that Europe has reacted in a more kind of unified way, and that, to a large extent was due also part, if we think about the Next Generation EU fund, I think has provided resources to countries in the periphery, such as Italy, to kind of help overcome some of the difficulties, and not just from an economic perspective, but also from to avoid, for instance, that increase in the risk premium that we saw for Italian borrowing costs for households and the government after the global financial crisis. So I'd say these are the 3 kind of factors that I think help explain why we found ourselves in this situation. I would just say to conclude that, we, as I said, we do expect that things should be looking a little bit better now. We think that the ECB, not just yet, but, in a few months should start cut rates, and that should give a bit more of a respite to demand, combined with stronger, finally, real wage growth, as wage growth is now outstripping inflation. I would flag maybe a sort of, risk for the future, also leading up to kind of discussion that we're going to have later. The first is probably that, the inflation battle is not quite won yet. We've seen some data today suggesting that inflation is coming down, not quite as fast. Some economists like to call that the last mile of the disinflationary process, as though my friends that run marathon tells me that not necessarily the last mile is harder than the previous one. So that's something maybe we can discuss later on. The other risk, I think, potentially in this phase is that, Europe, as I said, is facing a relatively low growth environment and underpinned by very low productivity. And that does create a risk that, we could see a bit more of a difficulties in terms of competitiveness. And also, as I said, wages are rising strongly with low productivity. It means that some of the cost pressures continue for European firms. So that's maybe the second challenge that I would highlight. And the third challenge, just to conclude, is that, some countries are coming out of this crisis with fiscal positions that are worse than the way they entered. Again, we had another reminder today with a quite significant upward revision of the Italian deficit last year. So that's something, again, we can discuss later on. But so there could be some challenges going forward in terms of consolidate some of those fiscal positions.
Thank you. And yeah, on inflation, we know inflation remains a significant concern also going into 2024, as you said, with headline at 2.8 and core still at 3.3. Professor Rosa, how do you see these inflationary trends evolving through 2024? And how do you expect the ECB will respond?
Okay, so can you hear me well? Okay. inflation has been coming down. I mean, to a very large extent, the battle has been won. In particular, headline inflation, the one that still contains energy prices, because the gas prices have dramatically decreased over the last year and a half. You know, at some point they were around 350. Now they're just above 25. So a huge disinflation in gas, which of course was reflected in headline inflation, which is now around 2.5%. As Fabio was saying, today there were some unpleasant surprises on the upside of inflation, nothing too dramatic. Core inflation, which instead outstrips food and energy prices, is a bit more sticky. It's still around 3%, 2.1%. And this is where things get a bit harder. So the real question is, will the central bank want to bring inflation down to 2%, or it's going to be happy with 3%? That's the problem on the last mile. Now, bringing inflation to 2%, of course, will respect the mandate and so on, but it might be a very hard battle to win, because there are some elements that make core inflation be more sticky. First of all, wage growth. Discuss 4.3% is annual wage growth at this stage. And is part of a broader redistribution of income between capital and labor. Over the last 40, 50 years, there has been a skew of the distribution from labor to capital, meaning rents and dividends and so on. And now we are in a phase, and we see with the rise of populist parties and the strikes everywhere, that labor wants, to recover some of this lost ground, which has been huge. So productivity in the US has grown by 300%, and wages have been stagnant for the last 30, 40. So this, is something that is not supposed to last for too long. So this is one of the main sticky points. The second, of course, is the digital transition, which is cost, the ecological transition that is cost, and so on and so forth. So all these elements mean inflation to remain on average higher than it used to be. So having inflation structurally around 2% is much more difficult. Given all these, how will the ECB react? Now, if they were to stick strictly to the mandate, they should wait for inflation to be around 2% or convincingly going towards 2%, and they have a very detailed forward guidance in what they would do. However, I think they will not wait for that long. I think the ECB will probably cut rates sooner than, let's say, the nominal mandate would suggest. Now, some of the hawks within the Governing Council would like to wait at least until July, if not later. Some of them say, no, let's do 2025. Some of the dogs would like to cut already in March. Actually, probably some of them would have liked to have cut already last time around. So a good equilibrium point is at some point in Q2, whether it's April or June, we'll see. But I think basically it's ready to cut rates, at least is waiting for that, because the economic activity, as Fabio was saying, is still very weak and needs attention.
Thank you. I now want to steer the conversation towards fiscal policy, and I want to hear Professor Codogno. So we know the EU rules in the last 3 years, the EU rules limiting national budget deficits and indebtedness have been suspended. And we have been hearing discussions to reform these fiscal rules, as there is broad consensus within the EU that more fiscal flexibility is required. What outcomes can we anticipate from these discussions in 2024?
Well, the discussion to some extent is already coming to an end, and we got some proposal that needs to be finalized by the European Parliament, but broadly speaking, we know how it will be. And the good news is not as much as, flexibility. I mean, flexibility is probably something that many Italians look after, but the key point is really to focus on sustainability of debt over the long run, which is what the new framework does, and also to focus on what is strictly under the control of governments, meaning expenditure. So there is a new aggregate that is really the focus of fiscal action, and is becoming the operational benchmark for governments, which is good news in my view. So there are some drawbacks in the new framework, but overall, I think it's a step in the right direction and will help European governments to achieve a better sustainability over time. Now, what is the optimal fiscal policy going forward? Well, it depends on monetary, it depends on the state of the economy. As it was mentioned, I mean, usually when you have the central bank tightening, that depresses aggregate demand, because that's the only way for central banks to kind of push down inflation. But this time around, it was surprising that effectively the economy has been very resilient. And one reason for that is the labor market, which has performed extremely well, not just in Europe, but I would say globally for a number of reasons. And the economy is still adjusting, okay, because we've got many shocks. We got COVID, we got the supply side shock, and then the energy shock. So the economy is still adjusting. The good news, in my view, and crossing fingers that nothing bad happens in terms of geopolitics, we are at the turning point, okay, in the global economy. Data are still pretty mixed right now, okay, so there's no clear trend, but we are turning the corner, which means that you need also some kind of rebalance between monetary and fiscal, meaning that probably monetary will have to, over time, gradually to ease. I'm out of consensus right now because I think the ECB will cut only at the very end of this year, okay? But it will eventually cut. It's not just a matter of when the ECB will cut, but also how fast it will move and what is the end point. So what is the so-called R-star, so the equilibrium interest rates at the end of the process. Then, if that is the case, fiscal should become gradually more restrictive, also coming from such big shocks with deficit much higher and so forth. So I think it's a no-brainer, to go for tighter fiscal policy. Today, as we speak today, if we take into account Next Generation EU, so European funds, fiscal policy almost everywhere is still expansionary. And that's why you can afford to have the ECB also to keep rates relatively high for longer in order to push inflation definitely towards target.
Does anyone have on fiscal policy?
No, I mean, I definitely concur with, I think, there is often you have to look at, fiscal and monetary policy in conjunction, no? And certainly there is a world here in which, you can envisage a scenario where rates stay a little bit more restrictive and fiscal policy a little bit more expansionary than maybe for a longer period of time. And also for good reasons. I mean, if you think about some of the challenges that Brunello was mentioning in terms of the energy, the digital transition, some of those things is not necessarily something that the central banks can tackle by cutting rates. Sometimes a lot of the clients, they ask, maybe because the German economy is in such a bad, difficult situation at the moment, no? So some of the clients, they say maybe the ECB should cut rates to help Germany, but the problem of Germany is not the money cost too much, is their willingness and ability to spend it, no? So to kind of have a slightly or leave more fiscal space for kind of fiscal to play a bigger role as we go through this transition, actually could be an equilibrium which might suit Europe. The one question that I would raise here, and maybe we can again follow up, is that ideally would be done more at the central level, at the European level, than leave the burden in individual countries.
Thank you. And now we've looked at monetary and fiscal policy. I have a couple of questions on how this will, affect the capital markets. So, Professor Rosa, we've seen, U.S. stocks last year, especially growth tech stocks like the Mag 7, getting all the attention, but we have also seen European equity benchmarks performing or at least improving from the lowest points in March, with Italian shares being regional winners. These results are close to the US, but without the US's impressive economic growth. So I'm wondering if these results can be sustained this year.
So let's look at things in perspective. So first of all, it is true that there is a big delta in the performance, the economic performance between the US and Europe, and unfortunately, I think is destined to remain there. It's a fact of the way the US is organized versus Europe. They are also less affected by the geopolitics that unfortunately is all taking place in Europe, the Middle East, so close to Europe. And from the energy perspective, the US is independent. Effectively, actually, they are exporting energy now, and Europe instead is still in the middle of this very difficult transition. In particular, Germany was mentioned, Fabio, as the worst possible business model. I mean, was buying cheap gas from Russia, cheap energy from Russia, and selling his own goods to China. So, which are not both on the geopolitics from on the other side of the equation. So, if you want to simplify things, so the delta in growth is there and is likely to be there. Now, markets are not driven just by growth prospects, of course. There are many other factors, including, of course, the monetary and monetary policy by the central banks. And therefore, this is supposed to have an impact. Now, it is true that European equities have performed as well as the Americans last year. However, they were also starting from a lower point. So that's something we should always remember. You expand the chart, of course, if you look at 1 year, 2 years, but you expand the chart, you go back to previous, the year previous of the global financial crisis, and you see a huge difference in valuation, right? So US stocks have gained as a share of global market capitalization massively in the last few years. So if for a couple of years European equities have done as well as the US is good, but we should never forget the starting point. Now, going forward, who's going to cut first? Who's going to cut more? In our view, the ECB is probably supposed to cut earlier. With this, we don't share the same view with Lorenzo, but it's probably cut sooner rather than later and earlier than the Fed. The Fed still has to combat sticky inflation, but especially strong growth and very strong labor market. So they are in a tougher position to cut rates. They have a good excuse not to cut rates for a little bit longer. And then, of course, the question, as Lorenzo was saying, is how fast and for how much will they cut rates? All these will have an impact in terms of the performance of equities in the absence of the growth prospects that probably are not as favorable as in the US.
Codogno, could you explain a bit your contrasting view?
Yeah. Well, first of all, if we compare the US with Europe, what really stands out is the US got a much stronger fiscal stimulus beginning because you got the Trump package plus the Biden package when he took office, and then the shock was somewhat smaller, okay, from the COVID shock. But at the same time, initially at least, it looked like the labor market suffered a lot. You remember a couple of years ago, there were plenty of debate about the so-called Great Resignation. So people basically moving out of the labor market. So the supply side of the economy shrinking. Okay, so there was massive stimulus to demand, but also supply was shrinking. So the economy was not in good shape. At the same time, because of the tight labor market, wages started to move up. So it was a very bad combination because, you know, a negative supply shock, higher wage and so forth. But suddenly the situation changed. How it changed? Well, The Fed started increasing rates quite aggressively and rapidly, even more than in Europe. Wages reacted with a small delay, a few months of delay. So wage growth is now slowing in the US. Productivity declined sharply initially, and it was a big worry about the supply side. But then suddenly the US economy showed a huge positive performance in terms of productivity. Now you have a very nice combination in the US with declining wages and rising labor productivity, which means unit labor costs are actually easing. So that makes the work of the Fed much easier, okay? Unfortunately, for a number of reasons, we got the opposite combination in Europe, because in Europe, initially it was okay because, you know, Next Generation EU supported demand and so forth. In Europe, we don't fire workers. We just put workers in the kind of short-term schemes, which is good if there is a temporary shock to demand. But as the shocks became not just one, but two, and then three, you know, and then the economy continued to suffer because of these shocks, then you need to allow reallocation of resources within the economy. And in doing that, the US is far better, okay? And so what happened in Europe is that we got a big surge in demand initially after COVID and so forth, and wages were not growing that much. Now wages are catching up because there is a kind of 2 to 3 year negotiation process in Europe. So there's a lagged effect, okay? Is it bad? It's probably not bad because, you know, workers need to get some compensation, but the problem is that it's happening now. And at the same time, you have a significant slowdown in productivity. So it's a very bad combination. That's why I think it will be trickier for the ECB, and the ECB will be forced to keep rates higher for longer. And so that's the idea. So in terms of you know, allocation, I think the US is better off right now. Okay, there are still potential for Europe. And the potential, I think we got letter the other day, and he mentioned the single market. The single market is probably the most important untapped potential for Europe. But also keep in mind that 3/4 of Next Generation EU funds have not yet been spent. Okay, so over the next 2.5 years, you will have a massive amount of resources that will be used and support the economy. So that is the kind of the area where you can find the opportunities.
Thank you. And staying on capital markets, Mr. Balboni, your clients at HSBC, your equity investor clients, what are their main concerns when looking at 2024? And perhaps could you touch on like what sectors of the EU economy do you see potential in this year?
Yeah, so I mean, investors, they move very quickly, as we've seen. So, you know, there was a moment at the end of, towards the end of last year, you know, where basically it was almost felt as the inflation battle was won. And then, you know, suddenly the market repriced their expectation for rate cuts and brought them forward very, very much. And now I think, you know, it's been a process of normalization, and, you know, it's come more broadly towards our view. And by the way, I'm going to act as a pacifier here because we see the Fed and the ECB cutting at the same time. So that's, okay. That's always cutting in the middle. But in terms of concerns, I mean, of course, you know, Ronaldo was mentioning geopolitics remains, you know, we've got used to sort of, you know, geopolitical risks. We've been in a war for 2 years now in Ukraine, and then, of course, Middle East, Red Sea, shipping costs picking up. So there remains a lingering concerns. And of course, you know, we probably talk about that later, but we got very important European election in June and US election in later in the year. So some of those, I think, you know, remain lingering concerns and about the impact that they could have. And I believe they also play a role in some of the central bank thinking, because, you know, if you read, for instance, every minute of the ECB meeting, there's always a quite relevant section talking about the risk that supply side shock could again lead to a burst on inflation. And again, the risk that that might kind of feed into kind of a negative wage and inflation spiral. So I think, that's certainly something that they remain concerned, but somehow we've got used to, and therefore are no longer kind of, priced in maybe in the way that they might have been priced in the past. There is certainly, a different growth trajectory that we see. I completely agree with Lorenzo here in terms of, the US and Europe, largely driven by a productivity, so a genuine kind of, strong productivity that we're seeing in the US on the back of strong investment in the digital transition, which unfortunately, yet again, it feels like Europe might have sort of been missing the train there. And as a result of that, for instance, we think that ultimately this should be a trajectory that is relatively positive for the dollar, for instance. We are quite positive on that. Again, lack of conviction from a market perspective. We've seen the kind of that sort of trade struggling recently, and that's probably as a result of inflows coming into Europe, partly as a counterpart of the ECB reducing its balance sheet. And therefore, we're starting to see kind of, some portfolio inflows coming to Europe, which are helpful. And they are to some extent, help strengthening the euro a bit. I mean, in terms of if we think about fixed income equity, I think, and I'm no expert here as I focus more on kind of economics. But to me, I mean, it's hard to kind of sustain some of the profit margin that we've seen recently. I think that's one thing, including for the financial sector. The financial sector has benefited hugely from this first wave of rate hikes, particularly in those countries where this wasn't translated to a higher rate for the depositors. And of course, Italy is one of those. So certainly some of the Italian financial sector has been benefiting from that gap. And I think, some of the companies, particularly the more energy intensive, will probably struggle. Europe is going through a difficult energy transition. Energy costs are structurally higher in Europe. And it could even kind of, come to someone questioning whether it's still viable to produce certain type of metal type of, heavy metal industries, which requires a lot of energy in Europe. So I think certainly those are the industries that we see struggling. At the other hand, we're seeing a strong rotation of the consumers from goods to services. So to our services is a sector that will continue to thrive. And I think, that's probably will still be the story, particularly now with demand that starts to build up again. On the fixed income, just to conclude in terms of, the kind of the rates, I think the market is getting much more selective. So there's no sort of conviction. As I said, the central banks are almost priced to perfection now. So I think people are looking for relative value type of story. And in that world, for instance, if you think about sovereign countries, clearly the countries that have got less debt to issue, so very low deficit, are probably the one that could benefit more in relative terms.
Thank you. Mr. Codogno, you also mentioned the elections, and I think this is a necessary topic. So 2024 is touted as the election year, with 40% of the global population and GDP determining their leadership this year. So I guess this is a more general question, but I'll start from Professor Rosa. How should the EU prepare for all this political uncertainty and all the different scenarios, like with the US election, with Trump, the Trump risk, the EU parliament elections, the UK, we have India, we have Indonesia. It's very uncertain.
Yeah, we got Mexico, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and you name Russia even. So we saw recent preparation for the elections. Now, if we stay to the elections in the major developed markets, so EU, US, UK, let's put it that way. Okay, so in EU, the most relevant question is what is going to be the majority that will support the next European Commission president, and could be the repetition of von der Leyen, of course. Now, so far we had the typical majority, which is composed of the EPP, the Socialists and Democrats, and the Liberals. That's by far the foundation of that majority. Now, the big game in town is seeing whether to this majority, there could be an addition from the ECR, the Conservative and Reformist group that is actually led by Prime Minister Meloni herself. Now, for the German component of the EPP, it's very hard to accept some of the members of the ECR into the majority, in particular the Polish, and to some extent, if Orban were to join the group, that would be even harder to digest. Plus, there's another element. It's never arithmetic. Last time, von der Leyen could enjoy the support of these groups, but then you have defections within the groups. And so the question is, how large is this defection? And how many defectors do you cause for bringing in a new group that can be considered not totally homogeneous? So there's lots of these discussions in Brussels that are not just, politicien, to use the French expression, is how to accommodate the needs for the future. And in Europe, that is slowly shifting to the right, how the European Parliament can reflect this shift to the right while remaining loyal to his founding principles, right? So this is, these are big, big things. And how the EU can find its own place between US and China, because that's the big theme. And here is where the UK and the US come into play. The UK, because they just left the EU, and just to remind everybody how extravagant they are, while the rest of Europe moves to the right, they seem moving to the left, and perhaps bringing in the Labour Party after, several years in opposition. We'll see whether this happens or not, but the Labour Party will have lots of challenges, especially how, settling once and for all the Brexit issue, in particular the implementation of Brexit, and potentially how to reap the benefit of Brexit, which so far has not occurred. The US remains, the one element that can change totally the picture, because all over the world we see a rise of populist leaders, more or less everywhere. Yet, if the US remains loyal to his own liberal democratic tradition, you might have populist leaders, even autocratic leaders, raising across the globe. But as long as you have this beacon of liberal democracy, which is the US, eventually, you can always hope that things will go back to normal to some extent. But if the US itself becomes, a beacon of populism, and they kind of abandon their tradition of liberal democracy, even if the rest of the world remains to some extent, for some time, liberal democratic and less autocratic, eventually they will also shift in that direction, which is very, very dangerous. So the EU has understood all this, and they know that eventually the US might not be there in so many respects, including for security purposes with NATO and so on. And so they understood the need to grow out of themselves and become something bigger and more solid. But it's not easy, because the EU is in the middle of its own transition of becoming a sort of federal state, the United States of Europe people dream of. But at the moment, it's still an association of countries that have lots of elements of sovereignty given to other authorities, the ECB, the Commission, and the Parliament, and so, but it's still in the middle of this transition. The US has finished this transition decades ago, but it took some time. I mean, they had a civil war on those issues, and still they haven't completely settled some of the matters. So these are the big, I think, challenges that come with this year election, which in effect is a repetition. I mean, the 20th century was democracy versus dictatorship, and democracies won. This is a repetition of the same battle, democracies versus autocracies. And we need to hope the democracies win. But at the moment, it seems that, the battle is ongoing and not necessarily going in the right direction.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned this new focus on national defense. And we've seen also an increase in these trade restrictive measures, which have the potential to throw globalization and democratic values in reverse. So, Prof. Codogno, do you see deglobalization on the horizon?
Yeah, there is a big risk because I think if you look at a simple graph that shows, you know, let's imagine a simple graph that shows trade over global GDP or global industrial production or whatever. You can see that effectively there's been a trend in globalization showing increased globalization up to, say, 2008, 2009. Then after that, there's been what is called slowbalization. So basically, a stabilization in the trend. And now there are worrying signs that the situation can actually go into reverse, meaning more regional trade as opposed to kind of global trades, and also some kind of fragmentation due to geopolitical tensions. I'm extremely worried, but I mean, if globalization goes into reverse, what you would expect? You would expect less economic growth, and you would expect higher inflation. That's as simple as that. And now I'm worried also because there is a concentration of risks over the next few months and weeks, maybe. You know, next Tuesday is the so-called Super Tuesday in the US, meaning that in normal times, you would have already a good idea about the two candidates. This time might be slightly different because Trump has a number of potential trials. You don't know whether he will go to the very end, to November, will survive to November, and maybe Nikki Haley is not giving up for that reason. And Biden, there might be some concerns about his health, you know. So there is more uncertainty than usual, so to speak, okay, on the candidates. I'm not a great fan of Trump, okay, but Trump, we know that it's a big spender, first of all, very much protectionist, and it could actually be a big geopolitical risk for the rest of the world, more than the US. So that could change the scenario. Add to that it was mentioned on the 27th of March, we have the elections in Russia. Of course, we know who's going to win, but the problem is that probably before the election, there won't be any counteroffensive, but after the elections, especially if Putin gets a strong backing by the voters, there is a risk of counteroffensive. And in a situation in which Europe is still a bit, you know, in the middle of something, and we don't know if there is enough leadership to respond in a proper way. So why I'm concerned? Because at the moment, nobody really expects. There is, I mean, the world is on fire, but nobody cares, right? So and I'm not saying that on a personal basis, but if you look at the so-called big data indices that look at the geopolitical risk, global uncertainty, and so forth, they are at historical lows or not far from historical lows, meaning that financial markets, but also economic players, are not prepared for a change in the scenario, okay? And let's put it this way, I see, you have to oversimplify, okay? But I see three scenarios. One is the baseline which we discussed previously. And a second scenario would imply additional tensions, meaning maybe tensions on oil prices, maybe tensions on the supply chain. And we have already seen that film. It means that the expected recovery in the global economy will likely be postponed by maybe 2, maybe more quarters. And so it's like the same scenario, but just postponed. And then there is a scenario that probably we can no longer completely ignore, which is war. It's pretty sad to say that, but if for whatever reason we end up with a conflict means not really on the ground, but could be a cyber conflict, could be, you know, more tensions that don't produce immediate conflict on the ground, but potentially could be very disruptive. If that is the case, it would be a complete change in the economic scenario. It would be a complete change in the sign of policies, because monetary would become immediately accommodative, and fiscal would have to finance the effort to kind of build up military capability. And so inevitably you would have big deficit spending. So it would change completely the scenario, the policy scenario particularly. Okay. It's sad to say that. I mean, I don't like to present these scenarios, but unfortunately, we live in a very bad situation right now where we cannot really rule out such extreme situations.
That's not what I wanted to hear. But
We need to hear.
we need to hear this, yes. And so in this uncertainty and almost dire scenarios, Mr. Valboni, you know, energy security and sustainability are still critical issues in Europe, especially in light of these geopolitical events. What strategies do you think European countries should prioritize this year to ensure energy resilience, whilst ensuring, you know, we stick to our climate goals?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, you know, it's very interesting to say that, you know, there are very few things that the Europeans can agree upon, and that does seems to be a bit of a growing consensus among leaders, for instance, to have more joint funding for defense spending. I think, you know, that could be something that Europe could be doing more in the future. And I think, you know, potentially even as an outcome from the US election. So, and that kind of, you know, moves us 1 inch closer towards, you know, that true kind of, you know, fiscal union that maybe Brunello was hinting at. So I think, you know, maybe that's not what we would like to hear, but, you know, defensing is one thing when Europe could actually get its act together. And I think the one positive spillover effect that maybe we didn't perceive at the time of the Next Generation EU is that ultimately, even if Next Generation EU ends in 2026, it did open a door for one way of Europe to fund itself that we see it being tapped more and more. You know, the 50 billion aid package to Ukraine that was agreed last December, that was tapped in the same way of kind of, you know, joint debt, and I can see kind of defense spending going there. Now, you mentioned the energy transition, which is obviously the obvious challenge for Europe, you know, because we've, as Brunello was mentioning, the German model was based on kind of, you know, buying cheap energy and exporting cars to China. So clearly that model is broken. We need to address it. And, you know, self-defeating to the extent that they decided to shut down the only energy that they had, which was nuclear, power. So clearly Europe has gone a bit blindsided through this energy transition and now realized that. I remember talking to the president of the Eurogroup like 2 years ago, saying, you know, back in the days that the Eurogroup energy transition was sort of, you know, the recurring joke he would discuss every 6 months. Now it is a necessity. I think Europe understands it. Where is still lacking a little bit is maybe the sort of the investment that is needed there. You know, Europe has very ambitious goal, more ambitious than other parts of the world in terms of, you know, carbon reduction, you know, zero carbon emission by 2050, minus 90% by 2040. But we're not seeing maybe the investment that would drive that transition. I think what has been very positive, again, Europe acts better in times of crisis. The Ukraine war has brought about a significant reduction in terms of gas consumption on the one hand, more efficiency, diversification of resources. So that has been positive. I think where Europe needs to work more is in terms of building its own energy and renewables and the network to be able to shift those energies across Europe. And again, as I said before, this is something that Europe ought to do at the central level, because we've seen last year when Spain, for instance, that in certain times of the year has got even an oversupply of its own renewable energy, but they can't send it to France because there are no networks. And the French don't quite like the Spanish to build network because they want to sell their own nuclear to Germany. You know? So we have to overcome some of these intra-country issues by a true European policies. And unfortunately, as Brunello was saying, the political cycles in Europe are different, which means that we got European election and then we got French election and German election. So there's hardly ever a window where everyone is comfortable enough at home to make a big push for pan-European policies. I think that's where the challenge is. And, you know, hopefully, as I said, sometimes crisis times can be good for some of this European progress.
Thank you. I want to thank our speakers for today, and I am mindful of our time. So I'd love to open up to questions from our attendees. We have a microphone. So any questions you guys have, just raise your hand.
So I wanted to ask you, what do you think will be the impact of the next generation of fiscal policies on inequality?
Start on should I? Okay. Well, it's not easy to say. Okay. What has happened actually since the pandemic? I mean, first of all, we got, as I mentioned before, 3 shocks, not just one, and they are mixing up together. So basically, starting as a supply side shock because COVID was a supply side shock, but any supply side shock transforms itself into a kind of demand shock over time. And then again, there's been a complication because you've got other, supply side chain issues and then the energy shock. So it's difficult to kind of separate the various effects. Next generation EU. Well, during the COVID, and we got most countries, I would say, not just in Europe, introducing massive fiscal support packages, okay? Part of them went to households, and ideally they were targeted to low-income households for obvious reasons. But also part went to companies, and the companies means the owners of the companies, effectively, okay? So unfortunately, the evidence we have so far suggests that these big fiscal packages went to the first quintile of this distribution of income, which is where they are supposed to go, okay? But also on the fifth quintile, so basically the higher income households. It's not clear why. Okay, my suspect is that again, big chunk of the support went to companies to maintain production and business, and so inevitably part of that went into kind of dividends and income for high earners. Next generation EU might be seen as similar to that, okay, to some extent. Although I have to say that it very much depends on the country, because the philosophy underlying the next generation EU was pretty much driven. There are these big objectives at EU level, but the actual projects were actually designed by national governments, and there are significant differences country by country, and so we have to look country by country. So far, again, not much has been spent in many countries, not just Italy, but also Spain and other countries. You know that Italy and Spain are the two big countries in terms of overall size of the package, not in terms of percentage of GDP, but in terms of percentage of GDP, other countries in Central Eastern Europe have been a big benefit, big beneficiaries. But again, in terms of size, Italy, next generation EU is basically Italy and Spain. And so it very much depends whether it will be spent appropriately in Italy and Spain. Again, my suspect is that it will end up pretty much the same as we have seen in terms of the support packages. So part of it will go in the direction of supporting the first quintile, but inevitably part of it will also go to the fifth quintile because of the support to businesses.
Thank you, Professor. Do you have a follow-up question? Okay.
Sorry, just additional question that in light of the future possible lowering of the interest rate by the ECB and entering in a stage in which the fiscal policies will be restrictive, do you think that those fiscal policies will increase again inequality, or maybe it won't be the case?
Maybe I can make a start. I mean, I think, as Brunello was saying at the beginning, actually, we are, even regardless of fiscal policy, we are seeing now a tension toward redistributing resources towards the lower income of the distribution in terms of, we're seeing quite significant increasing in minimum wages, for instance, in those countries that have minimum wage, not Italy, but, so that's, so I think that that is happening and is beneficial to some extent, where maybe, the question mark lies as to what extent, then will eventually also be accompanied by an increase in productivity that doesn't make that increase in wages become bad for competitiveness. So that's sort of the question mark. And I believe that's also the initial idea of Next Generation EU was exactly that, to sort of to give that additional boost to productivity, so that actually you can end up in a better sort of equilibrium. And I remember some of the initial estimates, maybe slightly on the optimistic end for some of the finance ministers, that productivity boost that would have got. But I believe the kind of the idea is still there, and hopefully through some of the reforms that we've seen, we're going to get that additional traction. So I don't think countries can afford to kind of ignore the kind of distribution issues. I think we've seen in France some of the kind of the issues now with the strikes, with the farmers, with the protest. It does create a challenge. It does undermine ultimately the ability, I believe, to pursue a true consolidation by countries in the future. I think that, to me, that is an important challenge, because unfortunately, as I think we've been sort of discussing, we will see higher rates, not at those levels, but certainly higher than they were before. And that means the country will probably have to spend a bigger chunk of their budget in borrowing costs. Italy's borrowing costs are set to double between 2019 and 2026, 2027. And that unfortunately leaves a smaller chunk of the total pie that can be allocated towards health, towards pension spending, that becomes, of course, bigger and bigger. So I think, that is the biggest challenge. But I don't think, countries can just afford to ignore all the issues together, because some of that redistribution trend is overdue to some extent, and I think, is a necessity and cannot be ignored.
Thank you. We had some other questions. Yeah, right there.
Thank you very much for coming. I wanted to touch back on your mention of inflation and the possibility of a higher baseline inflation, maybe from what we've been used to of 2% to a higher 2.5%, 3%. What do you see as the main economic consequences of this higher baseline inflation going forward? Thanks.
Thank you. I can start. So, as I said, we come from a period in which inflation was kept structurally lower for a number of reasons. I would say the two major ones were globalization and restriction to labor compensation. If you put these two things together, it's very hard to get inflation running away, because you have, for every country, low domestically generated inflation, because unit labor costs are kept low. You simply don't compensate workers for their increase in productivity. And you have low imported inflation given globalization. So the best possible scenario. Now, all this is going into reverse. Globalization is going slower. So globalization, as Lorenzo was saying, more regional trade, reshoring, friendshoring, which means duplication of costs, which means producing, instead of having one country producing for everybody in the world, you have several countries that need to produce the same things for various parts of the world, which means, again, additional costs. And then this big trend, I mean, the question on equality is testament of that. Workers need to be compensated for the loss of purchasing power that they suffered, not for 2 years, but for the last 50 years. It was a paradigm, trickle-down economics. I make the richer richer, and the poorer, so to speak, would become richer. It didn't work. Of course, it didn't work. So labor starts saying, we need to recoup some of the purchasing power. So two very strong forces there, deglobalization and increase to labor compensation. But then you have all these transitions, as I said before. The ecological transition or green transition is always considered to be costly. Nobody ever said that could be done in a costless way. From the Pigouvian tax to every sort of economic model you want to think about, it costs not to have an externality such as pollution and therefore increase in temperature and therefore climate change and with the associated cost. The technological transition or digital transition, this is the most interesting one, I think. For many years, advancements in technology have been considered deflationary or disinflationary. There was the so-called Moore law. The Moore law was every 18 months, I double the capacity and I halve the price. That's the best of all worlds, right? We are now in a situation in which if you want to keep up with technological developments, you have to invest lots of money. AI, machine learning, and all the rest of it is very expensive. You cannot simply, as used to be the case, fire to work as an iron engineer and eventually you with a stronger computer and eventually save cost. No, it doesn't work like this. You really need to invest heavily. So all these transitions add up, which means that inflation that used to be even below 2% in the next few years might be easily around 3.5%, and therefore is a new paradigm. This has implication for what Lorenzo called R star, or the equilibrium policy rates, and therefore for long-term interest rates. We are used to interest rates at the long end, 10 years, 30 years, a very low level. In Europe, around 1%, 1.5%, even below 1% at some point. But these are not, so to say, normal levels. 4.5%, 5% are so much more in the norm than these ones, and they are likely to return, in my view. And with that, of course, when risk-free rates are at that level, then market rates, and including those that we pay on mortgages and corporates pay on loans and so on, will be affected. Hence, the economic consequences that I mentioned.
Thank you, Professor. We probably have time for one more question, but perhaps I want to hear the two ones in the front row. Perhaps we can answer it in one.
Thank you. So you spoke a lot about ECB interest rates and the path of European interest rates. I was wondering if you could comment upon where you see UK interest rates going relative to the ECB. So would you see the Bank of England cutting before or after the ECB, especially in light of the fact that the UK has just recently entered a technical recession?
Oh. I can start with that. I mean, so in terms of ranking of the central bank, we're talking about challenging facing the central bank. We probably think the Bank of England has the biggest challenge of all because, we've you do mention rightly the kind of, the weak growth, but there has been a very significant negative supply shock in the UK. Largely self-imposed, I think we can say, but that's creating sort of some difficult dynamics. So they're facing like significant wage growth. Productivity is very weak. Unit labor costs are soaring in the UK, and as a result of that, even if growth, as you said, has been weak, and we expect it to remain weak to underperform global growth, but we do think that the Bank of England cannot afford to cut rates certainly sooner than the other central banks. So our view is that the UK will, as I said, we cut last. I think it's interesting that we have seen the sort of, the Council of the Bank of England still divided, with some people still going for rate hikes. That's something that you don't have at the ECB or certainly not at the Fed. And as a result of that, we've got them cutting in August. And then we think they will then follow through with 3 cuts this year, 3 cuts next year, so that the path is similar to what we expect for the ECB, but we see them slightly later. I don't know, Brunello, if you wanted to...
I agree on all fronts. So I'm not going to repeat what you correctly say. I mean, the biggest problem here is dealing with the aftershocks of Brexit, which has been largely ignored because of the pandemic. Let's hide the Brexit effects behind the pandemic's effect, but now these cannot be used anymore as an excuse. That's why I was saying that the Bank of England will have to do what they have to do. And as Fabio said, this 3-way split in the MPC is fun to watch, but painful for them. But then there's lots the government needs to do. And so this government needs to reestablish a strong relationship with Europe. They are not going to go at all into reverse. They are not going to reverse Brexit. They are not going to reverse some of the major decisions, including re-entering, I think, the customs union. that was a proper ideological decision by the Tory party. Nobody has ever voted for the UK to leave the customs union, because I just want to see in this country how many people know what the customs union is. So when they decided Brexit meant the UK leaving the customs union, when Turkey is in it, for example, or Norway is in it, I mean, I really want to see that this was an intention of the population rather than an ideological position of the Tory party. So there's a lot that this government needs to do in order to remedy some of these damages that have been made to the UK economy. Unfortunately, the Bank of England is just the result of other policies that need to be fixed, in my view.
I think I agree. So I don't have anything else to add.
Thank you, Professor Rosa, Professor Codogno, Mr. Balboni, for joining us at our first panel of the day. Please, a huge round of applause for our fantastic panel.
If I may, the round of applause goes to the organizers that they have to catch up with the studies now.
Thank you very much, guys.
Fantastic. Yes. Now, if I may ask our audience, you might have a ticket for our next event with Matteo Renzi. If you do, regardless, you need to exit through the left door and then re-enter so that we can check all your tickets. Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Non siamo cambiati. No, c'era la ragazza che prima sta facendo un sacco di cose. L'hanno presa. Outside.